Well, welcome to the 700 Club. Erratic, irrational, foolish, and stunningly misinformed. I'm giving you quotes from John Bolton's book, Slamming President Trump. What astonishing charge does Bolton make regarding a request to the Chinese president? And how is the Trump team hitting back to halt the release of this book? Jenna Browder has the answers.
The war of words between President Trump and his former national security advisor, John Bolton, is spilling over into the courts. The administration has filed a restraining order to stop the release of Bolton's new book, claiming it violates national security. In an exclusive interview with ABC's Martha Raddatz, Bolton gives a glimpse of what's inside his White House memoir.
Is the president lying?
Yes, he is. And it's not the first time either.
Bolton slamming the president, calling Trump erratic, irrational, foolish, and stunningly uninformed. And on the issue of Russia,
how would you describe Trump's relationship with Vladimir Putin?
I think Putin thinks he can play him like a fiddle. I think Putin is smart, tough. I think he sees that he's not faced with a serious adversary here. I don't think he's worried about Donald Trump.
Bolton also says Trump withheld U.S. aid from Ukraine for political reasons and suggested China's president buy more American goods to help him win the 2020 election. Trump's U.S. trade representative reacting to that claim yesterday on Capitol Hill.
Absolutely untrue. Never happened. I was there. I have no recollection of that ever happening. I don't believe it's true. I don't believe it ever happened.
The administration calls Bolton's claims bogus and is trying to block the book with a civil lawsuit. The president on Twitter. Wacko John Bolton's exceedingly tedious book is made up of lies and fake stories. A disgruntled, boring fool who only wanted to go to war. Bolton is incompetent. The administration says Bolton's book contains classified material.
I will consider every conversation with me as president highly classified. So that would mean that if he wrote a book and if the book gets out, he's broken the law.
They have to go through a clearance process before they can publish the book. And we don't believe that Bolton went through that process, hasn't completed the process, and therefore is in violation of that agreement.
A former Congressman, Trey Gowdy, questioning Bolton's motives on Fox News.
Oh, Bolton, if you really think he's unfit to be the leader of the free world, why didn't you say anything? Why do I have to buy your book to get that?
It's worth noting Bolton refused to testify in the impeachment trial, and in the book is critical of how Congress handled the process. CBN's chief political analyst, David Brody, says it comes down to a he said, she said situation.
In other words, the book is called In the Room Where It Happened. Well, John Bolton says he was in the room where it happened. But Donald Trump has a version about that as well. He was in the room where it happened. And then you've got a lot of folks within the White House saying that none of this is true. And part of the problem here for John Bolton is we don't have any actual words that Donald Trump said in the room where it happened. We have some vague generalities about what Donald Trump was talking about.
If it's not held up by the courts, Bolton's book comes out June 23rd. In Washington, Jenna Browder, CBN News.
You know, I have this to say about that. If somebody goes to work for another person, like John Bolton, Bolton was denied the appointment to the United Nations by the Democrats. They didn't want him because he was too hawkish in his views. So Trump takes him and makes him his national security advisor, makes him one of the top officials in his government. And once you have that position of trust, and you're employed by somebody, you owe them your loyalty. And if you break that loyalty, you've done something that is wrong. He got paid $2 million for this book. And nobody else in his right mind would hire somebody like that who's betrayed his employer. I mean, it's just wrong. If he didn't like Trump, if he felt that he was doing something immoral, illegal, or just foolish, he should have gone to him and said, Mr. President, I cannot agree with your policies. I'm going to have to resign. But he didn't do that. He stayed around, and he puts out this book. It's wrong. I mean, you know, regardless of what these allegations are, truth or otherwise, he should never have done it. It's a breach of trust, and it's just something that I could not abide with. And so Bolton had some tremendous concepts. He did a good job in terms of what he wanted Trump to do, and Trump resisted it. But he wanted him to be tough on Putin. He wanted him to be tough, especially on Kim Jong-un, and Trump didn't want to do that. But Bolton probably not was right, but he wasn't right in doing the thing he's doing. And so I doubt if anybody else would want to hire a man like that after he's done what he's just done. Well, in other news, a felony murder charge, that's what the police officer in Atlanta is facing for killing Rayshon Brooks. And now some officers aren't showing up for work in Atlanta. John Jessup has more.
That's right, Pat. Atlanta's police department reported a higher than usual number of officers calling out sick overnight. This after prosecutors announced charges against 2 police officers in the death of Rayshon Brooks. Fired officer Garrett Rolfe faces 11 charges, including felony murder. That carries a sentence of life in prison or the death penalty. The other officer is charged with aggravated assault. Police body and dash cam footage shows Brooks refusing arrest after police say he failed a sobriety test. Brooks then took one of the officer's tasers and pointed it at Rolfe while running away. Prosecutors, Pat, say this image shows Rolfe kicking the suspect after he's been shot.
Well, you know, this is a bad situation, but the truth is that they've already had a finding a few months ago that a taser was a deadly weapon. So when the suspect points the taser at a cop and fires it, that is like using a deadly weapon. And I noticed people who are familiar with law enforcement say that if a taser incapacitates a police officer, then that officer in turn is helpless, and the offending person can then take his weapon and kill him with it. So, I mean, it's deadly force. And to prosecute that cop for murder, it seems like to me it's over the top. And it was a terrible thing, but at the same time, that policeman had been censured before. And we must have a register of police officers who have been censored, and they need to be weeded out of police forces. But the idea of defunding the police does not ring well with the American people. And as a matter of fact, I understand politically it's mitigating against the Democrats now, because they're seen as those who want to defund the police. And the American people don't want that, especially the minority community, to think that the policemen will not be available to help them in domestic disputes or in cases where they're being robbed or mistreated. And we need police, but we need good police. We need to get the very best. And if we're going to spend some money, we ought to spend money on training and screening, and to make sure we're able to hire the highest type of police officers, because we're giving them a badge and a gun. And that's a rather lethal combination to put in the hands of somebody who's not responsible. John?
Pat, well, along those same lines, Senate Republicans introduced police reform legislation stressing accountability and transparency. South Carolina Senator Tim Scott introduced the bill. The GOP hopes it will help bridge the divide between people of color and the police.
Too often we're having a discussion in this nation about, are you supporting the law enforcement community or are you supporting communities of color? This is a false binary choice.
Senator James Lankford, who worked with Scott to craft the legislation, referenced the book of Revelation in the Bible and its image of the kingdom of heaven.
It's described as every tribe, every nation, every language, every people all gathered. See, for me, this is a biblical issue, as well as being a personal issue. But for us as a nation, it's a legal issue. And it's where we find inconsistencies of the application of the law, we are to correct it and to do what we can to be able to make it right.
The bill calls for an end to chokeholds, increases the use of body cameras, and sets up a national database for reporting incidents involving force. Illinois Democratic Senator Dick Durbin criticized it as a, quote, token, half-hearted approach. Scott responded by reminding everyone that the bill was introduced on the same day a racist gunman killed 9 people at a Charleston church 5 years ago.
The concept of anti-lynching that's a part of this legislation to be considered a token piece of legislation because perhaps I'm African American and I'm the only one on the side of the aisle. I don't know what he meant, but I can tell you that this day, to have those comments again hurts the soul.
Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell hopes to pass the legislation before the July 4th recess. Well, while reform might be the word of the day, calls to defund the police continue to resonate across parts of the country. CBN national security correspondent Eric Phillips gives us a closer look at what that might mean.
I spoke to 2 longtime law enforcement veterans who say whether or not they support this idea of defunding the police depends on what you're talking about. If you're talking about shifting money from the police to other areas that will serve society, then they're on board. But if by defunding you're talking about abolishing police departments, not so much.
This has been a nightmare that none of us ever want to relive.
In discussing the best ways to ensure public safety, Jim Birch, president of the National Police Foundation, believes abolishing police departments would be a catastrophic mistake. But he says shifting money to other agencies could work, especially when it comes to issues like mental health.
A police officer only has a few tools at their disposal to handle any situation that they come upon. A mental health crisis is not a great matchup for a police officer.
But he adds there can be concern.
Are they going to be available to respond at 2 a.m. on Saturday morning? Are they going to be able to respond on Sunday afternoon? If police officers are no longer responding to those calls, who's going to go and help that family that's in crisis? Because the last thing any of us want is to say, the police are no longer going to respond to these types of problems, and we're going to shift this amount of money to these organizations, only to find out that these organizations who now have this responsibility themselves say that's not enough money for us to do it. Now no one's doing it.
Birch underscores that an overhaul of policing is needed.
What we're really talking about here is fundamental change. We're not talking about something that you can fix in 4 hours of training. We're not talking about something that you can fix by giving a lecture to those who are currently out on the streets today. We're talking about a major fundamental change.
The number one issue in policing today is police accountability.
Patrick Oliver leads the criminal justice program at Cedarville University and served in law enforcement for more than 27 years. He says fundamental change comes down to the people.
Government is best served by godly men and women who understand that they're accountable ultimately to God.
He says government is God-ordained, and the power an officer wields is second to none.
So from verbal warning to deadly force, that's how much discretion a law enforcement officer has in our society. That's more than any other job in our society. And this job is only for people who are honorable men that love truth, who will judge rightly, and who will do what is right.
Oliver believes change starts with each officer, and that is the mindset he will have as he takes on an additional role. He has agreed to be lead consultant for the Ohio governor's new Office of Law Enforcement Recruitment. Eric Phillips, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Eric. Google is denying NBC's claim that it blocked conservative sites over, quote, racist protest coverage. NBC News claimed the tech giant banned The Federalist and Zero Hedge from Google ads for alleged offensive coverage of the George Floyd protests. In its report, NBC claimed The Federalist and Zero Hedge had been pushing unsubstantiated claims about the Black Lives Matter movement. Google pushed back, saying that The Federalist was never demonetized and said it only worked with the site to address issues in their comments section. The Media Research Center told CBN News this is an example of how conservative sites are under attack.
Journalism is pushing to demonetize conservative sites in the middle of an election year, which is clearly intended to impact the election. And Google, is working with them at least to some degree. When are you going to take? You're going to take down sites now because of their comment section? That's where ordinary people comment. And how are we to know that left-wingers aren't going on there deliberately saying provocative or offensive things?
Senate Republicans unveiled a bill Wednesday that would give users the right to sue if social platforms enforce their terms unfairly or unequally. Pat, back to you.
You know, there's one thing that occurred in the news today that's a little crazy. You know, we're going after these icons, these leaders who apparently were engaged in some kind of racist activity. So guess what they've done in California? I couldn't believe it. I asked our guys when I came in, I said, is this true? And they checked it up, and indeed it's true. No. What do you think they did? California doesn't like Christopher Columbus.
Yes.
Columbus didn't discover California. California came out of Mexico, but maybe it got from Spain. But anyhow, Columbus was funded by a Queen Isabella because he felt God had told him to go across the ocean in hopes perhaps of finding a sea route to China or whatever it was. But anyhow, he discovers the West Indies, and we used to say when I was a kid, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We learned that in school. You remember?
Right. Yeah, I sure do.
1400. Okay. Well, guess what California is doing? I mean, I couldn't believe it. They are taking from the State House the statue of both Christopher Columbus and Queen Isabella. California.
Well, they're highly offensive.
Can you believe it?
Who's not offensive?
Well, I mean,
it's crazy.
Just insane. I mean, how far are we going to go? And you mark my word, when you see the leaders of our country, the founders of our nation, there's going to be every one of them is trashed, and they're even doing the same thing to the statue of Abraham Lincoln. I mean, it's just appalling, but we've gone over the top, and we've got to get back to some degree of sanity. But the statue of Queen Isabella and Christopher Columbus, taking him out of the State House of California?
It's crazy. We live in strange times.
It's sanity. It's mass insanity. Oh, so much. I'll keep my mouth shut. I'll go.